Hello, I'm Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, joining you for another online presentation for horticulture. Today we are going to be talking about planting media. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about soil. I'm going to talk about the constituents or what makes up the planting media that you buy. I'm going to give you some directions on how to make some of your own planting media, which can save you a little bit of money if you're going to be doing that in bulk. And lastly, I'm going to finish up talking a little bit about growing plants in hay bales. So it should be an interesting presentation. I appreciate you joining me for it. If you have any questions, you can just go ahead, put those in the chat area. I'll be able to answer them as I go or at the end of the presentation. And if you're watching the recording of this presentation on YouTube, do keep in mind that if you put a comment down in the comment section, I will be able to see that. I'll get a little notification that tells me that you've asked a question or made a comment. And if it's a question, I'll be happy to come back in the comment section and answer that for you. So please feel free to do that. And if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're here in person, if you do go to that YouTube channel, go ahead and click that subscribe button. And that'll let you know when I have new videos uploaded. So if you miss one of these presentations, you'll be able to see it online. So starting off, of course, we have our picture of my co-worker, Ross Overstreet, working there in a salad table. Always good. And he'll be back in the near future to talk about lawns and some weed control steps that you'll have. So about the middle of February, he'll be in for a presentation on that topic. So starting off, one of the biggest things that we can do to really improve our success in gardening is to make sure that we have a good medium to grow the plants in. Oftentimes with the soils that we have, just natively, we may have problems with the structure of that soil. Oftentimes it's really heavy clay. Oftentimes it might have too much sand in it. We may have a deficit of certain nutrients, so nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium, even some of the micronutrients like boron. And we may have pH issues. Oftentimes we need to make sure that we're liming the soil or otherwise treating it to make the pH at the level that the plants are going to grow best. So there are a lot of growing media that we can use that are available for raised beds, for containers. And these are often going to be a combination of purchased topsoil, compost, things like pine bark mulch or soil conditioner and peat. There are a lot of commercially available growing mixes that we can grow in as well. And these are going to be really beneficial for us. As I've mentioned before, I grow all the vegetables that I raise at home in containers. That allows me to manage those soils really easily, really soilless mixes really easily, in order to make sure that I'm providing the plants all of the nutrients that we can possibly have, giving them good soil structure, good water holding capacity, and just all of the great qualities that are going to support the growth of that plant. Now, a good garden soil is going to have the proper structure that we want. It's going to have all the nutrients that we need in order to grow that crop. And there's a word that we use for that. That word is tilth. So a soil that is in good tilth is loamy, it's nutrient rich, has a good mixture of sand and clay and organic matter that's going to prevent compaction. But very rarely do we have a case where we're going to have that. And so it's often necessary to improve the soil that we're dealing with. Now, oftentimes, we can do that. Vegetables or flowers, all of our other plants will grow well in a wide range of soils, so long as we take some steps to overcome some of those basic shortcomings. And just kind of as a review, in terms of our soil types, there are different size particles and particles of different makeup that compose our soil. What we normally tend to think of, particularly here in South Mississippi, is either clay or sand. And clay has some benefits that it gives to the soil, and has some problems that come when you have too much. And you can say the same thing for sandy soil. So clay soils hold moisture very well. In fact, they often hold moisture too well. And they often contain a good amount of nutrients for the plant to grow. Because they hold moisture so well, they often dry very slowly, particularly in the spring. In areas that hold a lot of water, the plants aren't able to get the oxygen that they need for their roots. So that can be a real problem. The other issue that we run into with clay soils is that because the water penetrates through them very slowly, irrigation water or even rainwater tends to run off of them rather than getting down to the root zone where the plant can use them. Now, in contrast, we have sandy soils. Sandy soils really easy to work with. They're good. They're loose soil. The roots of the plant can move through them relatively easily, but they also don't hold water very well. And because of that, water just runs through them. And so plants that are in sandy soils can often suffer from moisture stress, and particularly when we get into some hot weather, which we are bound to get as we get a little bit later in the year. Another issue that we have with sandy soils is that as water runs through them, we can lose a lot of the nutrients that the plants need. Just runs down further into the soil column where the plant doesn't have access to it. So the answer to either of these situations really comes back to adding in organic matter. It doesn't matter if you have too heavy a clay soil, too sandy a soil. Adding organic matter will help stabilize that soil, break it up and separate those clay particles or bind those sandy particles together in order to improve the nutrient and water holding capacity of that soil. Not only that, but as that organic matter breaks down, its components continue to have soil improving characteristics. They release nutrients out into the soil. They're going to have positive impacts on some of the microbes, good bacteria and good fungi that live in the soil as well. And so if we have a soil that is too sandy or too clay, we can improve that by incorporating a few inches of organic matter down into that soil. So usually 2 to 3 inches down to a depth of 6 to 8 inches. We just spread that over the top of the soil and till it in. And by doing that, we're adding that organic matter down to the depth where those roots are going to spend most of their time. So, all of those benefits are going to be felt by the plants that are grown in that soil. We do want to keep in mind that those applications are not going to last forever. As the organic matter starts to decompose, we're going to lose a little bit of that impact. So we are going to, in each subsequent year, need to continue adding organic matter to that soil. If you have a particularly heavy soil, you might not see improvement for several years after you begin this. So it can be quite a process to add this organic matter in. And certainly that works very well for small garden areas. If you just have a small little vegetable garden patch or an area where you're growing some flowers in the landscape, it's not too onerous a task to add that amount of organic matter in. But certainly if you're trying to grow in a larger area, that can be a significant cost and a little bit of a challenge in terms of the work effort that's involved in that. Of course, as you're adding mulch or compost over the course of the season, that is beneficial as well, because that is going to be an organic matter that can break down and add to the soil as well. Now, there are a lot of sources of organic material out there that you can use for your soil. And really what you're looking for is a material that's abundant, that you can get an awful lot of, and that you're not going to spend a lot of money on. Here, of course, in Mississippi, we have a lot of pine trees. So things like pine needles are an element that we can use. Pine bark is another one that we frequently have a fair bit of. We have a lot of oak trees, so leaves from all sorts of deciduous trees can be gathered up in the fall, raked up, and composted and added into our soil. Um, you can use shavings or other wood products. Though, I am going to note, those are going to take a little bit of time to break down in the soil in order to really add in that organic matter. You can add in peat moss, particularly for a very small area. Peat moss can be added into the soil. Really works. It's very high in organic matter. It is kind of acidic, um, and certainly if you're talking about a large area, that is going to become cost prohibitive fairly quickly. But in a small area, it's perfectly okay. Now, oftentimes when we don't have the soil that we want, one thing we can do is we can use containers and raised beds. And this is a situation where growing media is going to be really important. And that growing media has to make sure that we have the ability to hold water, but drain easily. It's going to be able to carry the nutrients that the plants need. And our native soil really isn't going to be the best for that. So if we just use our native soil, we're inheriting all of those problems with potentially too much clay or too much sand. We might be bringing in some insects or soil-borne diseases. So what we do for this is we use what we call a soilless medium. So we're going to be using something as our soil that really isn't made up of soil. There are all sorts of different constituents that this is made up of, and I'm going to talk about a lot of those constituents as we go forward in the presentation, and just talk a little bit more about them. One of the advantages for me for these soilless media is they tend to be pretty lightweight. They're easy to move around. You have all of that advantage of carrying the nutrients, holding water well, with avoiding some of those insect and disease issues, and doing very well in terms of the growth of the plant because it allows for the air space and the water space that the plants need. Now, if we're just talking about containers or raised beds, I've seen a lot of those that are quite large. One sort of easy thing to do to avoid a lot of the cost when we start looking at soilless media is to keep in mind that we don't necessarily need to fill the entire container, raised bed or pot with that soilless media. So most of our roots are only going to go down to about 8 inches. I generally recommend that raised beds be a foot deep, just to give them plenty of space. But if you have a pot that is a foot deep and you have those plants in there, the bottom 4 inches of that pot you can fill with something other than that soilless media in order to take up some of that space. My favorite thing to use for this is pine cones because they're abundant. Generally speaking, my neighbors are very pleased to have someone come and pick up all the pine cones for them. So not something you'll generally have to pay for. They're fairly lightweight. They will decompose, so I'm not doing something like adding, one of the things that often gets recommended is packing peanuts, but I don't like to use those because the styrofoam really just kind of never goes away. But pine cones work very well, just to kind of reduce the cost of the amount of media that we're talking about. So these soilless media I mentioned are made up of a lot of different things. One of the very frequent components of that, we're going to start with the organic parts of that, and then we'll move on to the inorganic ones. But peat or peat moss, as we often see it, is a very common component of soilless media. And you can see there in the picture, that is a peat bog where they are harvesting peat. So the moss breaks down over time it builds up that really thick bank of this material that has a lot of really great qualities for raising plants in. It's got an excellent texture to work with, and the only thing we need to consider with that is it does take a long time to form. So there are some issues around sustainability, but it does a fantastic job of increasing water holding capacity, and it's a fairly lightweight material. Now, the most common one again is that we're going to see is peat moss. It's derived mostly from sphagnum moss, which you see up there in the top, and it is just decomposed moss that has formed over a long period of time. You're usually going to be kind of a tan to brown color. Very lightweight in terms of the materials that we'd be using. You see about 6.5 pounds per square yard, which is not very heavy at all, or a cubic yard rather. Um, Very high in moisture holding capacity. One thing we do need to consider when we're using peat moss is that it is very acidic. Generally has a pH of around 4, so any mix that has a lot of peat in it needs to be limed in order to raise that pH up to the level where the plants are going to grow best. One issue that you do have with peat moss, and you can often see this when you have plants in containers, is that peat moss, when it's dry, does not like to get wet. So you can have a big container full of it, and you spray it with water, and the water just looks like it sits right on top of that soil and doesn't want to infiltrate down into it. So peat moss is just inherently hydrophobic. It repels water up until it gets wet. So whenever you're using it, as you're mixing the material, it's really important to add that water to it slowly. Make sure that water really gets in association with that peat moss, and we don't want to let it dry out all the way because it'll have that hydrophobic problem again. So we'll often also see another material kind of derived from the same thing. This is sphagnum moss. Not so much a planting material, but it is often used for just shipping. You can use it for propagation. We often see it lining baskets like you see here. And there are some things that have been extracted out of that can inhibit the development of some fungal diseases. So sphagnum moss has a little bit of resistance to that, and it works really well as a lining material. It works really well for these things like hanging baskets, but that is really the application there. Now, my favorite material to use for a planting material, and I use this for seedlings all of the time, is called coir. It's spelled COIR, but we say it coir. And it is made from coconut fiber. So whereas peat moss takes a good long time to form, those bogs take many, many years to form. Coir is much easier to get, and it's much more renewable because it's really just ground down coconut. And it is an effective substitute for peat moss. Looks very much like sphagnum peat, but it's much more kind of a granular material. And it's you can see the coconut husks there. They're ground down into the material you see there at the top. And it's not identical. There's a little bit more or less of different plant constituent chemicals in there, but it does hold water fantastically well. It'll hold 9 times its weight. It's really resistant to breakdown. So one of the things that we have whenever we're dealing with planting material, as that organic matter breaks down, it shrinks a little bit. So coir doesn't shrink very well, and it's a lot easier to re-wet after it dries. So I think it's a really good material to work with. Sometimes you will see bags of this. Oftentimes you see it in little seed starting pellets, like you see up there at the top. And that's just a really easy planting material to use. Add water to it, it breaks up. Sometimes I wind up with the large version of that, which is about a 1 foot by 1 foot by 6 inches. And you just add a bunch of water to it. It breaks up into a big pile of soilless media for you. Now, another medium that gets used particularly in raised beds here in the South is softwood bark, pine bark, essentially. And when we're talking about outdoor container nurseries, or if we're talking about raised beds, this is a major component of those media. It works very well. And for a long time, this was just treated as a waste product. Um, but it works fantastically. We prefer pine bark to a hardwood bark because it decomposes a little bit slower. There's less stuff to leach out of that pine bark that can potentially damage or inhibit the growth of plants. And as they are cutting pine trees, they strip the bark off of the tree. um, and that bark, for the forestry company, often they just make a big pile of pine bark off on one side of the lumber mill. But when you're processing bark, you can screen it down to different sizes. And the potting media that we want to use is usually about 70 to 80% pine bark in particles that have been screened down from anywhere from 1/42 to 3/8 of an inch. And some smaller particles than that as well. And that's worked very effectively for me and for others in this, in making, raised bed media. Does very well at holding moisture. Does very well at carrying nutrients for the plants. And now some other materials that can be used, probably a little bit less commonly, but interesting to mention nevertheless. Rice hulls. This is another agricultural byproduct. All sorts of forms of this are available: fresh, aged, carbonized, composted, and parboiled. Generally speaking, we don't want to use fresh rice hulls in a container because there may be residual rice in there or some weed seed in there that can cause us some misery along the way. But parboiled rice hulls work very well. Parboiled basically means they kind of pre-cooked it a little bit. And they do that by steaming those rice hulls. That's going to eliminate any weed seed. And it works very well. It's a very good alternative to spacing materials that we'll talk about really quickly. Doesn't really add a lot of nutrient to the plant, but it helps space out the soil to allow a little bit more air and water space in that soil. And they break down very slowly, so they last long term and are very effective for that. I did see a question going back to the pine bark section. Whether you occasionally can get termites in the pine bark. I have seen that happen, where you do get a number of termites showing up in your raised bed, and I've actually seen the termites get into broccoli plants and damage them, and a few other plant species as well. So it is important to keep an eye out for ants or for termites. And I would recommend a drench treatment with permethrin to deal with that should it come up. Another waste material from agriculture that works very well is cotton gin trash. Of course, you need to be close to a cotton gin in order to use this, but there are several around. Really does a good job of increasing the water and nutrient holding properties of the media. Has a pH that's in a reasonable range for a lot of the plants that we want to grow. One thing you do want to watch out for it is there can be a lot of salt associated with it, but if it's leached with water, those salts kind of get out of it, and it makes a very effective medium. And I know some people here in South Mississippi, the other side of South Mississippi for me, who make very effective use of this. Getting into the inorganic amendments, these are, of course, they're not going to be something from an organic source. Perlite and vermiculite, which I'll talk about in a second. Perlite is really used in there as a spacer. So it's very commonly used in greenhouse growing media, nursery propagation. In fact, 100% perlite is sometimes used as the thing that they're propagating plants in. But you're going to be really familiar with perlite if you bought a bag of potting soil at a local garden center. As you're moving, as you're looking down at that soil, you're going to see some white material in there, and that material is perlite. And it is mined. It is an igneous rock. They heat that rock up to a very high temperature, somewhere between 1100 and 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, and it expands as it's heated. And when it expands, it's closed off. So there's no place for it to absorb or hold water. And so by adding it into mixes, we can improve the drainage, or we can increase the ability of that soil to have air infiltrate down into it, which you remember the roots require to get oxygen. It's very lightweight. It doesn't really react with anything chemically. Doesn't affect the pH of your soil. Doesn't smell, doesn't react with anything. So it's a very good inert material that, again, essentially serves to just kind of space out the soil. Very similarly, vermiculite is another mined material. It's also heated to produce the finished product. And it has kind of a plate-like structure, which actually will help hold a large amount of water and nutrients. So used a lot in propagation mixes. There are different grades of size for it. And you can see, what you're normally going to see when you see is just kind of a brownish material that's very, very lightweight. And if it's expanded, you don't want to compress or compact it, because that will break it down. But very effective as a spacer in your soil, also holding some nutrients. So one thing I always like to make sure I include in this presentation is a good basic recipe for potting mix or soilless mix to go into a raised bed or a container. And I have two recipes that I add on. And one of these is for woody ornamentals or for planting beds. And the other it tends to be for annuals and herbaceous plants. So this is the one for woody ornamentals. You can see the largest component here is going to be a pine bark mulch, or just really composted pine bark. And that is 6 part of that to 1 part sand. And then the rest of the constituents are going to kind of be dependent on how much of the material you're making up. And that if you just need a bag or two from the you just need a couple of cubic feet or a few cubic feet, there's nothing wrong. Just go and buy a few bags from your local garden center. It works very well. But if you're going to mix up an awful lot of it, then it does become cost effective to mix your own. So 6 parts pine bark, 1 part sand, and then for every cubic yard that you make up, that's 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, you want to add about 10 pounds of a good dolomitic limestone. Now, dolomitic limestone, you're going to see that as garden lime at your big box store or garden center. And most of what you're going to see is going to be dolomitic lime. Dolomitic lime is separated out from calcitic lime because dolomitic lime has magnesium in it. That's really the only difference there. You're also going to want to add some fertilizer, and about 14 pounds per cubic yard of a good slow release fertilizer, generally something in the ratio of 18, 6, 12. It doesn't have to be 18,612, but a little bit more nitrogen than you see for the other numbers, and a little bit less phosphorus there in the middle. Um, and generally, again, you want to try that fertilizer 3 times more nitrogen than phosphorus. And a good product for that would be Osmocote 19612. Osmocote, you're probably familiar with. It has that kind of coating over it that slowly releases those nutrients out into the medium. And you can always add about 10% of compost. Hopefully, everybody has a compost pile. But that compost does a really good job of improving the structure of your mix. Now, when we talk about 10-year annuals or container gardening, this would be my mix for the vegetables that I grow or annual flowers, things like that. Again, we're starting off with a pretty good proportion there of just pine bark composted. To that, we're going to add 1 part of peat or core. I try to use core if I can get it. And then you're really adding just about the same thing here. You're adding the 10 pounds of lime, dolomitic lime, 14 pounds of a slow release fertilizer, and that's going to serve you really well. And if you're not able to take notes, again, you'll be able to find the recipe in the webinar file that I provided the link for. All right, so now we're going to take a little bit of time. We're going to talk about growing in hay bales. This is just an interesting thing to do. It's kind of an interesting thing to attempt and a different way to grow things. And it works very well if you have access to a large, the number of hay bales that you want relatively inexpensively. One of the things I like about this is that after you use the hay bales to grow in, they usually last for about a year. And after that, you can gather them up. You can add them into your compost pile, and that just builds up your compost pile. And so you're not really losing any of that material. Makes a very quick raised bed using hay or straw square bales. They hold water very well. They're at a good, convenient height to make gardening easy. And so, when you're selecting a hay bale, one thing, a wheat bale or rice or barley straw bale are going to be really good. They drain very well. But straw bales, but rather a hay bale that we're more used to that's, down here, Bermuda grass or Bahia grass are also going to work. You just need to watch their drainage a little bit more. And you do want to make sure that they come from a field that wasn't treated with herbicides, because sometimes those herbicides can persist in the bale for a good period of time. And you want to make sure that you select a good, firm, tightly tied bale. Sometimes they have 2 strings, sometimes they have 3 strings. Just depends on the person who produced that bale. But they do come in different sizes. Once you get your hay bale, one thing that I always want to make sure I tell people, you want to set that hay bale down where you're going to be putting wanting it to be in your garden, and that's where you want it to stay. Once it's relatively light when we start out, but as we go through the process, that is going to get much heavier. So arrange them while it's easy to do that, rather than once they start to get heavy. Won't pay attention. Put them somewhere where they're going to get the light that the plant needs. You can arrange them in lines. One of the things I think is really neat is just to make the raised bed out of the hay bales. When you're done, you shovel them in the center, add new bales, and you're in business again. The surface should accept, should tolerate the water. Place it so the binding twine runs parallel to the surface of the soil. So basically, you want to set it so it's flat on the ground. and leave that twine on there because that's going to help that hay bale maintain its shape over the course of the season. So what we want to do in order to grow in this hay bale is basically we want to compost it in order to grow in it. So first thing we're going to do is we are going to soak that hay bale with water, which can take a significant amount of water to do that. So you might be adding about 15 gallons of water to each bale you're using, and then you're going to want to add about 3/4 to a pound of lime to the top, and just fork that in. So just take a garden fork and incorporate that lime a little bit, and then add about 1/3 of a pound of ammonium sulfate. That's going to be a 3300 fertilizer. You could use urea as well. But the recommendation used to be ammonium nitrate. That's a little bit hard to find these days. And as the process continues over the course, over the course of it composting, you may need to add in a little bit more of that nitrogen fertilizer to get it to compost. And then just a little bit, about 1/5 of a pound of superphosphate, which is 0,460. Some micronutrients, if micronutrient solution is helpful as well. And if you got a really good fertilized field, you may not really need to add those fertilizers, but it certainly won't hurt. And then as it's composted, the fertilizer, it's going to make that bale warm up. That is going to be really easy to tell. Right now when the temperatures aren't high, you can put your hand on that hay bale and you'll actually feel the temperature of that bale rising up. It could get up to about 100 degrees. And just check it every day. You may need to give it some more moisture. And if it's not warm by the 3rd day, add in a little bit more of that ammonium sulfate fertilizer, or 3300, in order to kind of kick that process of composting off. Once that's done, we want to add in a little bit of top cap, just about 3 to 5 inches of soil across the top. Mix that with of soil mixed with 50/50 with compost or with peat moss. What that does is it just protects the hay bale from drying out too quickly, helps that hay bale stay good and wet. In terms of planting, you're going to plant directly into them. You can put 2 tomato plants per bale, up to 4 peppers or 4 cucumbers, 2 or 4 lettuce plants in there. Like containers, if you put a tall plant in there, you need to make sure it's supported well or it will fall over. One of the things I think looks really neat is putting flowers in the bales. I think that just gives a nice look to them, and I think it's a great way to add in some annual flowers around a planting area just by putting that hay bale there. You do occasionally need to watch out for slugs if you have hay bales. You can generally just get rid of them by trapping them. Beer trap is the most effective thing I've ever used for control of them. Just put that beer right down at the level of the ground, and the slugs will go check it out and get rid of that problem. You really won't have a lot of weed problems, so you can just pick those by hand. Any insect or disease issues, you treat them the normal way, same as you would in any other medium. When you get done, remove the old plants. You can start new plants just by poking a new hole into the bale. Check it and make sure that bale is still pretty well together. Add some more fertilizer to support that second crop. And you'll generally get what I say, I say you'll get 2 seasons out of them. So if you do plants in the fall, in the spring and in the fall, that is generally what I think you'll get. And so after that, one of the things that, again, that I mentioned I think is great is you can take that hay bale, break it up, add it to your compost pile, use it as use the remainder of it as mulch, and that works very effectively to keep that material in the landscape rather than being something that you would throw away. With that, that's my presentation on planting media. Again, if you have any questions and you're watching on YouTube, I would appreciate it if you put that down in the comments section. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button And with that, for those of you who are here today, I will be happy to take any questions that you have now.